Hello everyone. I hope you can hear me. A very warm welcome from the IFHP in this second session of today, which will be a masterclass on affordable housing and the inclusive city. Now, for those of you who were with us in the morning, welcome back. We had a very interesting morning in the IFHP Summit where we had some presentations. But for those of you members of the IFHP that were not there, a very warm welcome from me. My name is Savas Verdis. I'll be your moderator for the next couple of hours. I'm the co-director of the Executive Masters in Cities program at the LSE, and it's my great pleasure to be working with the IFHP over this afternoon. Hi, everyone. So I hope you can all hear me. I was muted for some time. A very warm welcome from me on this IFHP masterclass. My name is Savas Verdis from the London School of Economics, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon's event. What I would like first to do is to explain a bit more about the format of the masterclass. And what the IFHP wants to do with this session is very much introduce a new format of learning, which is a blended learning format. And now some of you have already accessed the new learning platform that the IFHP has launched called the IFHP Academy, where the idea is for the organization to post online courses on subjects from affordability to adequate housing and the inclusive city. So it's very much a repository and a knowledge base for members of the IFHP to reference over the next few months. For those of you who did log in to the course, you would have seen that there are two specific sessions, one on adequate and affordable housing, and one on inclusive growth. So the format this afternoon is very much as follows. We'll be, in one sense, recapping some of the material that some of you accessed online. Don't worry if you didn't access it, we will recap some of the main ideas and then get responses from the experts and protagonists who were featured in the online course. So there will not be presentations as such, more about discussions from the content on the platform and some of the questions and answers that you put forward to us. Now let's begin with the first session, and this is on adequate and affordable housing. As you will see, this will take us over the next hour and 20 minutes in terms of the discussion. We'll then take a very short break before we then look at the second course on inclusive growth. And the adequate and affordable housing masterclass will be divided itself into two parts. First, defining adequate housing and places, and secondly, housing in the time of crisis. Now, I'm very pleased to be in the company, and you will soon see them live on your Zoom by these prominent experts in this sector. Claudio Azzioli, who some of you met this morning in the summit, who's a housing and urban development specialist for many years, was a key member of the UN Habitat Strategy for Adequate Housing. Alonso Ayala, who's an assistant professor in housing at the Institute for Housing and Development in Rotterdam. Michaela Kauer, the head of Brussels office for the city of Vienna and the coordinator of the EU Urban Agenda on Housing Partnership. Nicola Tolin, who is a professor in urban resilience at the University of Southern Denmark, and Mari Vatovara, who is a professor and director of the Institute of Urban and Regional Studies at the University of Helsinki. So I'm very pleased to welcome our participants, and hopefully now we see everyone's faces, so hello. And thank you very much for joining us. And as I said, the format very much would be to recap some of the key findings in the online course, beginning with the notions of adequate and affordable housing, and then going on to deal with questions around housing in the time of crisis. So that's the general plan. And what I want to do now is prompt the discussion with some key highlights from the course. And I guess this is one of the first parts in the online platform that we were trying to define. And this is a slide taken from Claudio Azzioli's work on defining affordable housing in this adequate housing in the 7 different dimensions of adequacy, whether it's security of tenure, the provision of services, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. You also had the pleasure, some of you, to read the article by Alonso Ayala on the 5 A's of definition of adequate housing. And what I would like first to do, and this was actually one of the first questions that was asked in the online platform that I would like to put to Claudio, is where do we usually get it wrong from the perspective of integrating all of these different dimensions? Because as we will see later, when we look at the case study of Mexico's national housing program, a lot of the times we deliver on certain aspects of adequacy and not on others. So I guess the first question for us, and Claudio, over to you in terms of your experience working in different contexts, where do we usually get it wrong so that these dimensions are not integrated in the right way and we're only able to deliver in some versus others?
Thank you. It's difficult when you are the first one to kick off, but since you put me on the spot, let me elaborate on that. I think that we, as policymakers, we have made a great advance when the International Covenants of Socioeconomic and Cultural Rights recognize the right to adequate housing and unpacked the levels of adequacy, which later on was further defined in the fact sheet that I happened to be one of the members of the team, the fact sheet 21 that talks about the right to adequate housing, which elaborates a bit more on the 7 adequacies that you elaborate. In the morning, I spoke and I've been very vocal about that, is that if we realize the full and progressive right to adequate housing as formulated in the Habitat Agenda and in the new Urban Agenda, and is incorporated in Agenda 2030, meaning that member states, even those who have not ratified the convention, the covenant, and those who have undersigned and ratified the covenant, they actually have committed them to realize that right. Now, when you read the kind of commitment the member states have made, the full and progressive, is because we're not saying that states have to build houses, every single little house for its citizens, but create the conditions through which different socioeconomic groups can actually access progressively, incrementally, that and realize the rights. So when a state provides affordable finance and provides access to serviced land to its whole population in a planned environment, it's actually creating that condition. Now, this is important when we say creating the conditions, because in the human rights debate, is not that very often you see that it's not an immediate fulfillment and protection of that right, but it's a process for which that right is realized. So this is from the point of view of creating a legal, international legal framework that becomes inspirational, because I can, as civil society, organize myself and make a claim publicly that my government is not fulfilling its commitment with the international community. Okay, so that's one point. I think this is, now in terms of what is going wrong, as I mentioned in the morning, we've been working very conventional, and I would even say very old-fashioned for so many years in the housing area, in the housing sector. Yeah, you go, for example, housing finance. Housing finance hasn't changed in the last 50 years. You know, it's okay, you have securitization, you have different types of credit, you have different types of subsidy, but the model has remained the same, assuming that everybody will get a loan, the loan has a maturity, you are indexed or not indexed, you pay a certain mortgage, it's according to your income. In the Netherlands, you can deduct home ownership in your income tax, so you actually pay a bit lower on a monthly basis. So there are different configurations, but the model has been exactly the same. While in the whole world, people build incrementally. Housing has a time. It's the realization of the adequate housing is timing as well. The time is a variable. So I have done a little study about how do people actually build and reach their ideal adequate housing. It takes time.
That is fascinating. That is a fascinating perspective.
It takes time.
Yeah.
And then, so housing finance needs to understand that, so that you go to Africa, the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa issued every year the annual book, and there are 58 countries, and an average of $30,000 is the price of a house, a typical house in all these countries, and only a tiny percentage is able to afford that. The rest cannot, even people who have a regular income. So what do you need to do is change, and we're not changing the system. And I'm not going, perhaps later on in the discussion, I have not even touched the issue of land, which is in Africa is even more complicated. Why is we getting wrong? Why? Because you have the customary land ownership coexisting next to Roman-based types of property rights regime, where investors and bankers and even governments say, ooh, this is, you know, I'm not going to touch this, because you do something there. The next day, there are 3 persons claiming the same plot of land legally because they have some kind of title or some kind of entitlement. That. So I'm not going that yet there, but, you know, to finalize in one sentence your answer, we haven't been able to get it right. We have come close to it in many countries, many cities. Some experiments have been done quite nicely. São Paulo in a certain period, the Uruguayan cooperative, you see the Netherlands in a certain period with the rental and the housing association. So Singapore, Korea have done in the issue of scale, in mobilizing finance and land, but, you know, in a more, I would say, authoritarian manner in the first period, you know, but, you know, all this shows that there are ways to address, and we can pick up this and put it together. Yeah, then we come to.
Yes, Claudio, thank you very much. And I think one of the your insights, which is very interesting, is not to see these 7 dimensions in a fixed point in time, and the extent to which settlements or cities reach this incrementally, you know, over time. But I guess the main, you know, or important question there is, to what extent do certain typologies of housing allow for this incremental achievement of adequacy in the different sectors, and other typologies might not necessarily allow that. I think that's a very interesting component, putting the time dimension of how you can actually achieve that. Alonso, perhaps I can bring you into this discussion. And again, the question is more about where do we usually get it wrong in terms of seeing this achieved in an integrated way?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, and from Claudio in the last session, no, because that gave me starting point. Because if you look at the article that I share with you, which is also the work of the housing team of the IHS, it's not only my work, it's also Marge's, Van Aert, and Ellenhert's work. The way we define adequate housing is through these 5 principles that we call these 5 A's, which are accessibility, availability, affordability, acceptability, and adaptability. So we're talking here about affordable, adequate, and affordable housing. But for us, affordability, as in the 7 dimensions of adequate housing that Claudio showed from the perspective of housing rights, affordability is embedded in that as well. So adequate housing is broader, and affordability is part of it. The thing is that also, if you look at the housing challenge and the global affordability crisis, as it has been defined, and also Claudio talked about that in the morning, the aspect of affordability is so strong that's why I feel people always talk about adequate and affordable housing. They make it as 2 separate things, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, just to answer your question, is that where we got it wrong, to say it in a very negative way, as I feel, is in the affordability aspect. Yeah. I'll try to make it as an example from our framework of the 5 A's, because we believe that these 5 dimensions of housing adequacy are interrelated and are connected to each other, and it's very difficult to separate one from the other. For example, if you talk at availability of housing, then in order to fulfill this principle and achieve adequate housing, the availability of housing has to be in the right locations. Yeah. And what you see many times is that what is affordable to people, yeah, or to more people, let's say, is usually located in the wrong locations, yeah, in the fringe of cities. Yeah, so you fulfill the affordability aspect, but the availability of housing in the right location is not fulfilled, so that becomes inadequate. And then the affordability of that housing unit, because as Claudio also explained, housing is more than houses, becomes problematic because you need to move from that faraway place to employment opportunities. And that affects your affordability as well. So this is all interrelated. Accessibility to infrastructure, for example, to trunk infrastructure, that's also a problem when you talk about this available housing in the wrong locations. Sometimes the land is not even serviced properly, etc. Yeah, and then comes the other aspect, which are even more difficult to achieve, which are the acceptability of the housing outcome by people, which has a strong cultural element to it, and the adaptability of it. And then I'll refer to the conversation where the conversation with Claudio stopped, because when we talk about adaptability, we see it from 2 points of view. One is the adaptability to climate change and the necessary resilience that the housing needs to have, yeah, in these times, but also the adaptability of housing to the changing needs of the household and the family throughout its life cycle. And that has to do with incremental housing approaches. Yeah. Now, these incremental housing approaches are not only about how you build the house through time, yeah, as resources are made available, etc. Especially when you talk in a context where informality is big, and this is how many cities in Latin America are built, no, informally. I mean, Claudio comes from Brazil, I come from Venezuela, and we share that very strongly, no? The favelas and the barrios of Venezuela are very similar, yeah? And this is all made progressively and informally through time using the technology that is available in the countries. So that incremental process is for us crucial to understand. And this is not a new talk. This has been from the 1960s, has been discussed by John Turner. But the point is that incremental process in terms of affordability needs to be translated also into the financial aspects, no? Incremental financial strategies to give access to people with low income to some kind of financial support to incrementally build their houses in a better way.
Alonso, this is very clear, and perhaps one of the questions that I would just like to share now on the screen, and this is a question. These are the answers that we've been receiving over the last 7 days on the online platform. Touches on some of these relationships, specifically the relationship between affordability and adequacy. And let me just find the specific question here, if I can find my PowerPoint. My apologies. Well, no, I have a problem here, but I do remember it. And that was specifically in the context of Nigeria. One of our members asked the question, and specifically in Abuja, we've seen many different occasions where when we achieve adequate housing, let's say in Claudio's 6 dimensions, markets are very quick at making them unaffordable. So in one sense, getting the other dimensions right, whether it's proximity to public services, proximity to jobs, all of the important aspects of adequacy, all of a sudden you have the markets reacting very quickly and making them unaffordable. So what are some of the best practices to deal with that? And I guess it's an obvious thing. Markets are very good at internalizing and monetizing these advantages. Claudio, would you like to reflect on that?
Okay, there are many points to address, and I'll pick up a few of them. Taking a piggybacking on the Abuja situation. Now, let's look at the city, any city, and assume that one half of the city has water, has electricity, and has public transport, and the other half doesn't have anything of that. So what happens? It happens that if you want to move your location from not having those to the one that has, you will have to pay a premium. That's how the market works. The more easy or the more accessible you are to the benefits of the city, public transport, amenities, school, depending on what your needs, the higher the price of that location will be. That's how land markets operate. And we need to understand that. And when we talk about policies and going to scale, one of the things I have hammering as well is about providing basic infrastructure, which means service land. Why? Because you will take away the premium, you will put everybody more or less on the same level, you level the ground, and you have diversity in supply. And then most likely prices will go down and stabilize. And obviously, if you want to live in front of I'm just going to the most famous shopping mall in Abuja, you will have to pay for that extra, for that location, because land prices that comes into the property prices is about expectation. And the expectation I have as an owner of that location is that prices will go up. And if you bid for that price, I'm not interested to sell. And that's the beauty, if I can call it like that, of land markets. That is the demand that is determining the price, who is willing to pay or bid for that price. And there, if we don't understand that when we're doing urban planning and linking that to housing supply, which means service planned land that I go to scale and I provide the locations, various locations for housing to be built in different ways. So housing opportunities rather than just buildings. we will need to have the buildings ready because there are people there that needs government assistance, point. But there are others who do not. Okay, so this is one. The other element that I think and goes, perhaps I'm accelerating, sorry about that, is about the tenure options. Okay, so we are building a model that assumes that everybody wants to be a homeowner, and it's a single home ownership policy that you find everywhere. And I keep asking my colleagues everywhere I go, please think about it and explain to me, and that goes to our group here. How do you explain that the richest countries in the world have large parts of their housing stock in rented occupation? Significant. Where I am, 46, between 42 and 46%. And that's the Netherlands. That's a wealthy country. It's one of the top 10, I would say. Now, you move out of here. The poorest countries in the world are becoming nations of homeowners because it's one single policy. And there are sufficient evidence out there saying that the diversity is not only the scale, but the diversity is very critical for affordability and inclusion in the city, but above all, that you will not have like the Spanish Federation of Young Adults, of youth, going publicly and protesting against the housing market because it does not allow them to emancipate. So you have 40-year-old guys marrying and living with dad and mother or with in-laws. It's the worst situation you have for young households because they can't afford that. Because the single option, and it's a country where the majority of the housing stock is home ownership, and is where you find the biggest problem in terms of affordability to access housing. So we need to go beyond this traditional, conventional wisdom of the way you've been working, because otherwise we won't get out of this trap, and we keep going to the trap.
Claudio, that's very clear, and I guess this kind of two dimensions that you mentioned. First of all, the infrastructure provision, so that land is well served, but then secondly, the diversity of tenure, so that the rental sector becomes as important, is a key issue. And I guess this also relates to the next chapter in the online course, which was this case study that was co-written, a report by you and Habitat, on the development of housing in Mexico. And this was the work of Nicola Tolin. And the report is fascinating because it gives a bit of a historical precedent of Mexico's development in terms of the different phases that it went to in terms of its involvement in housing, beginning from the 1960s with a very heavy national involvement where the ministries would choose the location of some of the housing, which was then quickly followed by a liberalization of the housing market, like in many other South American countries, where a lot of negative externalities, the wrong type of housing was built probably in the wrong place. And now this model from the last 10 years with a slightly better integration or coordination between housing policy and urban policy.
Abbas, allow me one thing here.
Yes.
Since you mentioned Mexico, I was responsible for developing the housing profile in Mexico in 2012, 2013. The government wanted to look back on 10 years of housing policy and what went wrong. So I worked with the National University of Mexico City, and there was a team of experts, and we did the same process of housing profile we did elsewhere. Now, what we came out is it's dramatic. In the end, we had like 5.9 something. I just round up 5 million housing units abandoned, semi-occupied, vandalized, right there. People paying for it because one of the success of the Mexico rate of development per year was between 400 and 600,000 units a year. That's what they were producing, is that they put certain things together. Supply of land. They allow the let's say the usufruct land that they inherited from the Mexico Revolution to allow that to be privatized and sold in the market. And then what is the result? The investments of housing moved from 7 kilometers from the city center to 37 kilometers from the city center. Why? Land is cheap. I can take a high portion of the housing cost for my profit, and I make it very affordable. So, but they did not think that the cost of mobility from location to jobs, they couldn't handle. And
I think,
people,
yes, I think this is what makes it such an interesting case study. And perhaps we can bring Nicola here in terms of some of the figures that Claudio mentioned. I mean, the figures are staggering in the report. 2 million units delivered over the space of 3 years. If I'm correct, that is incredible for UK standards at least. But only 80% within consolidated urban areas. So, Nicola, why do you think this was the case? And can you quickly take us through some of the recommendations that you're making so that these more dimensions of adequacy are met?
So there are a number of elements. Retaking what you briefly introduced as a timeline from the 60s to nowadays, we've been passing through heavy state intervention from the 60s to the 90s, with the location imposed by the federal government and development, massive development done by national government. Then we pass to a liberal phase that is lasting from the 90s to the mid 2000s, where this liberalization is coming with a very strong financial provision from the state to private sector, particularly developers. And developers at that point, they are looking for higher margin profit. And the low-hanging fruit there, it's go where the land is having no cost, meaning as far as possible from the center, in areas that are agricultural or in areas that are protected as communal areas, taking over that and make development. Because in any case, it will be accessible to a number of people that are receiving subsidies for that, and then they will get themselves as developers subsidies for that. This is co-creating some of the problems that we are experiencing also nowadays. Then we have another phase from 2006-2019, where there is a little bit more integration in between housing policies and urban development policies, urban planning policies and systems. This is fundamental because in the previous part, there was no consideration for location. The incentives were not related to the location. There was no understanding of context. And again, the profit was leading all the logic for specific location and developments. Then now we are entering with the new federal government in place from 2019 in a new phase with another type of integration that's more related to policy between federal and local level, a better harmonization of the structure and the all stakeholder, institutional and non-institutional involved in the process. And then also a major shift of financial resources available from the state, not going any longer to build new finished houses, but tower refurbishment of existing stock. And here we are speaking about something like 85% of the finance made available will be for refurbishment, renovation, and consolidation, and only 15% will be for new housing, with a very specific focus to vulnerable part of the population, meaning also the one having informal job activities that are normally not covered by the two main hypothecary banks, the one for private sector and the one for public sector. Going back to some of the point made also and the numbers cited by Claudio. Clearly, the work that I've been contributing to doing was based also on Claudio's earlier work in a large part. just a figure, between 2011 and 2014, ONAVIS, that's the National Institute for Housing, has been developing a huge number of new housing. Out of these 3 years, 37% of the houses produced in the 3 years are nowadays inhabited. They've been abandoned. Again, it was because the location, yes, they were affordable because you could pay the property and all that, but they were so far away they become from job places and requiring so much movement and transport that become soon after unaffordable again. There was not provision of basic services. But it was not just a question of distance from the center. It's a question of a wrong principle of planning, of lack of planning, lack of control in urban development, and basically also funded on a wrong economic model. The uncertainty regarding workplace and more and more change in job, change in wage, passing from being employed to unemployed. It's no longer a world where anybody is having a fixed job that maintain a good provision. So the term affordability, accessibility and all that are time bounded. They're not once and for all the same for a lifetime. And among the things that we've been focusing, and this was together with Ines Magalhães, former Minister of Housing and Planning for Mexico, and Fernando Portela, former Minister of Finance for Mexico, it was to look particularly, exactly as was mentioned before, to rental, to option for rental. Because again, the needs and the possibilities are changing more and more rapidly. And there is a very big housing stock already available within intramuros, within the inner city, without going to peripheral cities. Yes. We've been focusing also in some provision regarding the access of vulnerable groups, the one that are having informal work, to look particularly at all the urban texture, the urban fabric that was not that is not well taken care, well kept, not only building. The reduction on the environmental impact of the housing and its resilience, particularly to our climate change or to our geological disaster as earthquakes. And then to look at the life cycle of the city in order and of the housing in order not to contribute further in emitting, not during the construction, not during the use phase of the houses.
Thank you, Nicola. This is extremely clear. And again, I urge people to go through the report. It's a fascinating case study. Perhaps we can squeeze in one question before then going into the content that Mari presented in the online course on density. And this has to do with one of the latter recommendations that you said, Nicola, which is around social rent and promoting social rent in this housing context. And the question, and I'm not sure if Claudio is still with us, but also for Alonso and Nicola, is do you have evidence for the right tenure mix, whether it's on rental or on ownership, that might lead to adequate housing in a specific...
There is a basic principle that, again, housing and its affordability and its equitability is something that can change in time. It's time related and it's not related just to the individuals that want to have access, but it's related to various economic, also environmental conditions. So the mix, there shall be a mix that also possibly can include the different type of cooperative type of properties.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I think one of the kind of, the aspects is depending on the context, but definitely in a lot of the European context, social housing is the housing that is probably of the better quality on average than other tenures. So that we always forget that in one sense.
Yes, and there is also rental is not the silver bullet.
Mm-hmm.
There shall be a mix, but clearly also rental present some difficulties regarding affordability constant in time. And so there should be also protection. Then there's a question how to maintain difference in between the renter and the property. There are a number of issues, but again, to favor a certain mix will encounter better or give better alternative for particularly low income or with less stable job situation, not to go far away where the land is having lower prices or where there are not service, not basic service or in general service, and have the possibility to have adequate housing.
That's very clear, Nicola. Thank you.
And the last point, it's also regarding a sort of still orientation towards zoning. Still of dividing the reason why some of these settlements that are now unoccupied is the reason that they were created just as housing settlements with no other type of service, with no job around and all that. Paradoxically, in some part, COVID show us that this division, eventually we can work it through a little bit better, but still not for all part of the population and not for all type of economy, because working from home works fine, but only if you have a service type of economic structure.
Yes. Thank you, Nicola. We need to move on to the next section. But before that, and perhaps I can ask Alonso to kindly answer via chat, if it's possible. There's a very interesting question of, what might be a successful institutional framework in a national context where the 5 A's have been applied successfully, what you think? And we don't have time to discuss it, but you could open a chat discussion on the tab below. Now, let's move to the final section of this part on adequate and affordable housing in the online course. And this was a provocative article by Mari Vatovara. Provocative because for a lot of time, and I think LSE Cities is a culprit of that, we've taken density or high density, perhaps sometimes as a proxy for quality, in terms that higher densities can or allow public services or infrastructure to be viable economically. And we need this critical capacity to make some of these services valid. And Mari, in her article, argues that we've been a bit myopic on this aspect, of the high density cities, and there might be some viability for us to look elsewhere. And Mari, the microphone is yours, and I think you also would like to share some slides.
Yes. Us. Yes, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and I definitely would like to add to the complexity of the affordability and inclusive cities from the perspective of research that I've done in Nordic cities and in Helsinki especially. And I'll show you a few things, but during the last 20 plus years, I've been doing empirical studies on the growth and changes what have occurred in the Nordic cities. And to add really to the complexity that we've discussed so far, I would say that we are not ready yet either. And in my perspective and work, I would like to stress the contents and the concepts that we have been using. And after writing the article, I've been working, I was asked by several ministries and the biggest cities in Finland to suggest something for urban policies in Finland. And for the work, I started to look, what should I propose for the future? And I actually went and saw all the new developments, what's going on. We have these beautiful concepts, and now I'll switch to my sharing the screen if I manage to. Do you see it now? Yes.
Yes.
And hopefully I can still. Okay. Yes, so and I need to move your faces, wonderful faces from the front of my own screen. So I'm challenging not only the density, but also the concepts of sustainability and participation, things that we really value for. I think they are great and beautiful concepts, but how about the urban outcomes? I guess that's the perspectives, that what should we actually do to get the cities beautiful and sustainable. This is I love my city of Helsinki, my university in this picture as well. It's one of the most livable cities, as we say. We have odd things going on now during the COVID, the city center, all these pictures are showing that the city is really developing nicely. But as we heard in the summit this morning, when we talked about Copenhagen, the new development is a bit different to the development that was actually planned, like this square, already 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So whether and what have we really learned is, I guess, the question. This is my city. If you look at it structurally, I've taken out the center of Helsinki, which is in the middle, and this is how it looks like. If we just discuss the density, with the very moderate density, we could bring whole Finland to this picture. So I don't think we, in most of the cities, in Nordic cities, lack space, but rather, as I think Jan Gehl nicely said, a bit more rigorous thinking of the plan and the neighborhood. The growth of the city, even if we talk about sustainable, dense cities, it's scattered, as Mike Batty has said, all in Western countries. This is what's going on, even underneath of these beautiful perspectives. And we really went to see all the new developments with my colleagues Anssi Joutsiniemi and Jenni Airaksinen, and unfortunately, this is what we have if we look at dense cities or density as the guiding rule. It's a density within the maximum density allowed within each of the blocks that we use. And these are the pictures. This is Helsinki or Espoo or Vantaa. If you look at the traffic, it's taking most of the space. If you look at the building sizes, apartment sizes, it's very different story empirically. And therefore, I concluded in the paper as well that density is an obsolete concept due to our current mobile lifestyle. And according to the standard definition, density is just the measurement that compares the amount of matter contained within an object. So it's really cool to play around with different densities and contrast that to the different qualities that come as an output. And I think it was already 1912 when Raymond Unwin, in his very famous book, wrote that there's actually nothing gained by overcrowding. The possibility to move 10 times faster, 10 kilometers further, opens a land supply of 100 times greater than before. The other perspective shortly, I would like to show you in just a few slides. I went through, for the first time, I have to say, through my, through the laws that actually should direct the development of urban. What has happened in there? So the National Land Use Building Act of Finland, which now, after the newest renewal, highlights, in addition of these densities, sustainability and participation. The objective, as is written in the law of the act, is to ensure ecologically, economically, socially, and culturally sustainable development, and also to ensure that everyone has right to participate in the preparation process. But again, what about the outcome or the output? If 200 years ago, what the law, this is unfortunately in Finland, I just finished it last week, so I haven't had time to change it. But if we started from defining the road and the lot and house, where can you place these? We draw this development as an onion. Later on, we had more laws to take care of, more institutional actors that are on green on the bottom to get involved. And that's what happened. And the newest law not only has these large, beautiful new concepts, but also, therefore, it now asks us to take into consideration 5 or 10 different laws and about 10, 15 different institutional players. And for that, the law defining the locations of buildings and roads and rights of private and public space, the evolutionary process in the law to include these great concepts, indeed has become general, national, or even international, very specialized and detailed, but I would argue that it has lost its capability to give and evaluate the outcome or the direction of the realized urban development. And as my last slide, few more pictures, these could be taken from anywhere. I think we are still not there with our beautiful, even academically fostered concepts.
Thank you, Mari.
That's my perspective.
Thank you very much. And perhaps we could focus on some of these visual images that you brought together, and perhaps you're critical of the types of landscapes that are being produced. And is your argument that although this deliver greater density in terms of their final output, some of the wider outcomes that we discussed before in terms of adequacy are not met? Is that the principal argument?
Yeah, it's one of the principal arguments. I think that instead of even these constitutional laws, even if they aim to make a change, they actually seem to allow the contemporary to evolve, not to an agreed and wished and dreamed direction, but rather to something very different, which is really rarely looked by anyone, and the outcome is not really evaluated, and therefore we can't really even get grasp of the systematic errors that the institutional structures are building on top of the admired one.
I just want to kind of bring your insights in relation to, for example, what we were discussing before in the context of Mexico, a very different development context, but there is in that first case study, so the one that Nicola Tollin was talking about, the fact that a lot of the housing was not built in the right places, i.e. there were peripheral, peri-urban locations without the right amenities. And Mari, is your argument that actually thinking too closely on putting as many new households close to urban areas that have these public services might be asking the wrong question, and that we need to look again at our smaller cities and towns in terms of their viability? Is that an argument that you're making in the article?
In the paper that I did, I think I was focusing more on that, and there I would love to have a few more hours, but in there I think there are developments, the energy changes, the coming of electric cars, the batteries, where can we storage the renewable energies and all that, that might actually challenge the idea of being closer. It's actually 60s idea, compact cities or contact city, and then you get the services. So I'm maybe my point is that to get the legitimate process of guiding even distantly the urban planning, we should look at the outcome and evaluate that, and then rethink the actions and even the sentences in law.
Okay, thank you, Mari. And again, I urge, for those of you who didn't read Mari's article online on the platform, to please do so. It's a very interesting take on density and rethinking density, where we can actually meet some of the wider outcomes and specifically some of the concepts around the adequacy that we discussed before in smaller towns or villages even, which have become much more prominent during the pandemic, when a lot of us have actually left the very inner, city crowded areas, at least in some cities in the developed world. Now let's move on to the second part of the online course. And here I would like to bring Michaela Kauer and also later Claudio on the current crisis, and specifically housing in the time of crisis. And crisis seem to be coming to us every couple of years. It's the norm. We're surrounded by emergencies all the time. What was interesting in Michaela's article that you can also access was from an EU perspective, to what extent this new crisis, the pandemic that we're currently facing now, is any different to the previous crisis around the financial crisis that so strongly affected the housing sector. So perhaps, Michaela, you can summarize the main argument, but also tell us why is it different this time? Why is this crisis different to the last one, in that we can make greater leaps and progress to the types of outcomes in housing that we want?
Yeah, thank you. And I will also try to answer some of the questions that have been put into the chat by giving a response.
Thank you, Michaela.
And refer to some of the points that have been already addressed by the co-panelists. As you know, I'm coming from Vienna. So Vienna has a big of a reputation on social, affordable, and especially municipal housing. And I think that one of the lessons we can learn in this specific crisis, the Corona crisis, is that big diversity, and that has been said already, in your housing system is a key factor to protect people from eviction and losing their homes or homelessness in general. So when we look at something that we have developed on European level in the last years, which we call now the housing continuum, it's a bit where you can see that in the affordability spectrum, you will see all kinds of local and regional and national solutions when it comes to provide affordable social housing for citizens, especially in Europe, in the European historical context. And then you will see that you can have things like the classical municipal housing that we know in Vienna, the Gemeindebau, where we have 500,000 people, like 500,000 people, every fourth Viennese person is living in municipal housing. So that's already a strong protection from any crisis development. Another 400,000 people in Vienna do live in cooperative housing. And I really would like to make a strong statement for cooperative housing and for not-for-profit housing associations at this point, because they are the model that is always a little bit forgotten in this strange, I would say, antagonism between the rental and the social. So there is no such thing in our housing continuum where you can say, because social housing is rental. I mean, you have a rental contract in most of the cases. Even if it's a social housing agency, you get a rental contract as a tenant. If it's in the private sector, it's rental. And at the same time, if home ownership is very often an illusion, because it's the bank owning the house or the apartment. And people in Spain, for instance, have experienced that in the last crisis to a great extent, when we saw that around 300,000 people have been evicted in Spain from their homes because they couldn't pay back the mortgage. So home ownership is also something where, I mean, there is a bit of an illusion in it. The thing in between is cooperative housing. And it may sound a bit boring, old-fashioned. You could also name it like co-housing or, you know, find new words, but in the end, it's co-ownership and very participatory living together, because you share the responsibilities, but you also share the little profits, which is in this case, in most cases of cooperative housing, it's the absolute security of tenure that is in many cases going as far as you can give it. Your children will be able to inherit your cooperative flat in most of the systems that I know in Europe. So I think that do not forget this. In German, there is a word that is called Gemeinnützigkeit. It's very difficult to translate it into English, but in the end, it's about creating a common good, and creating something for the common good. And I think that what we saw now in this crisis, and this is very different to the global and financial crisis and its effect on housing. We see that now many cities and states, especially in Europe, have, and also in other countries, it's not true, globally, they have taken very strong interventions in the housing market during the corona crisis. They have put moratoriums on evictions, on rents. They have installed rent caps. They have really taken a lot of strong regulatory measures. And I think the reason, obviously, it was not only an economic crisis, where we all know that if you are in an economically bad situation, this can also have very negative effects on your health and on your well-being in general. Because living in poor housing conditions will not be very good for your health in any case, or living in overcrowded conditions. But this crisis now, it's more than economic, it's a health crisis. And therefore, to protect the health of citizens, states and cities started really to intervene very, very strongly in the housing system. For me, this is a chance, because I think that the really, like, say, free-floating forces that we have seen developing and emerging since I would say the late 1990s on the global market, and those forces, I mean, they learned us a lesson, because before, and classically, you would know your landlord as a tenant, and you would be, he could be nice or not, but you would know who is the person, who is the company. You would really have, you know, and there would be a way to get a grip on him or on the company if something was going wrong, like no maintenance, or I don't know, yeah, could be anything. Nowadays, with the financialization of the housing markets, which we have seen globally, this has become very, very difficult. Very often, I mean, if you look, for instance, at Berlin, it's a few companies only that own the big share of the private rental market, and people will not know to address if they have an issue, just as simple as I would say, like the elevator is not working. Yeah. So I think that the disconnection from I would say the capital and the investor from the local user, consumer, this is something we have seen in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. But this is something where we now do see in this new crisis that intervention is possible and intervention is taken. And I think this is a chance to further develop a bit on the variety, diversity, and stability of the housing sector, and especially of the housing financing modalities that we see at the moment. One word about affordability, I think that would be interesting, because it also has to do with the crisis, I would say. We have always discussed affordability in a way that we say it's a relationship between income and costs. It's a very basic definition, but it really allows you to look at affordable housing from two sides. And you can always say that look at what happened after the global financial crisis. The incomes were stagnating. They were really stagnating. The incomes, they were even going down in many cases. Precarious work was going up. Instability of income was the norm in some population groups, and the housing costs were skyrocketing high. I mean, this was, so we had really this problem of affordability. Not only, it's all right what has been said about the displacement, and it's easier if you, the costs of movement and of mobility, these kind of things. But the relation between income and housing costs, this has had a bad effect. What we do see now is that if after Corona, we will all face a recession, it's already here. It will be a very big economic recession globally. But what will this mean for the ability of people to pay the rent or pay the mortgage? So, and the last word about affordability, if you do it in a sound methodological way, you will immediately land at the gender dimension of affordability, because income patterns between men and women are still not where we want them to be, obviously. And protecting women, for instance, from domestic violence is much harder if they cannot afford to find their own flat and to leave the guy who's beating them and their children. So, but affordability is always, if you do it right, I think, it's always also you have to have the gender dimension as a layer in it. Otherwise, it will not work. These are my first thoughts.
Thank you, Michaela. This is very interesting. Perhaps we can build on this and specifically look at some of the national contexts that have been extremely engaged, let's say, in this emergency moment to change course. And speaking from the UK, some of the early policies about stopping evictions, we're seen in a very positive light. And there's questions also on Zoom in some other contexts, where even the kind of migrant settlements, informal migrant settlements in European cities were being housed in order to prevent infections within these camps. So there was, very positive responses, both at the national and the city levels. But to what extent do you think we can build on this? So, what are the best measures? Is it activism? How do you influence policy to make this more permanent? I think this is a kind of, very important question, because some people are saying, well, this is just a blip and we'll just, press pause and start all over again.
Yeah. I think that's a very good question, and there will be, I think, several answers or dimensions of an answer to it, because there's differences on what you can do on city level, on regional or country level, and on European level. I would say let's concentrate on European level, because there we can see that there is a shift in the discussion clearly. A few years ago, I was told that by the people working for the European Commission, we are never going to talk about anything with relation to housing, because this is not a competence of the European Union. Forget about it. Yeah, no way. But what we see, and this is, the case has been proven clearly, the European Union has a very soft power, but it has a power to influence national and regional and local housing conditions. What it does not have is good data, for instance. Yeah. There is really no whatsoever subnational database on housing. It's always very tricky to see what is meant by what. You cannot compare Estonia with France when you look at housing. You can maybe compare Tallinn with Valletta, could be, maybe, yeah. But if you don't have a subnational database, this is already a problem, because then how evidence-based is the policy development that you are trying to undertake on a certain policy level or government level? So this is one thing. Having good data will allow you to better monitor the situation and to then also develop the right conditions. What I don't think is already really in the mindset of European decision makers yet is the broad variety of housing solutions. What I've been talking about first, the housing continuum. When you look around, it's so incredibly rich what European cities, regions, and countries have developed. it's the solutions they found to provide their people for affordable housing are of a great variety and very impressive. And I would say that obviously every country has done it very different. But I think that if you, for instance, want to mobilize empty vacant homes, this is a big issue in for instance, when you look at Strasbourg, then you have to do something to create incentives to do that. But that means that we cannot have any whatsoever European definition of social housing, because some people will then think, okay, it's the social rental agency in Luxembourg, it's an HLM in the suburbs of Lyon, it's the public housing of Sweden, it's the municipal housing of Austria, it could be everything. So I would want to have a definition of social housing, but I would love to see more involvement on European level when it comes to better data and monitoring, and especially to indicators. What we've been talking about this day already a few times, the affordability effect. You cannot discuss affordability without discussing housing cost overburden rates. And the indicator there is a historic indicator from the 1940s, which was developed for Australian banks to set up the right repayment rate for a mortgage for a house of a male only income family nourisher. I don't know the word in English, but you know what I mean. Yeah? So, I mean, we're talking 1940s Australia, hello, yeah? So what I mean is we should really start also questioning very critically and in a very also open way these kind of indicators. We are now proposing on European level, a lot of stakeholders, for instance, to set this in the housing cost overburden rate at a quarter of the income and not at 40% of the income, because we have longer life expectancy, we have different income patterns, we have different family structures, we have a lot of single people who also want to, you know, live. So setting the housing cost overburden rate at a fourth of the income, again, builds the bridge between the costs element and the income side of things. And in both, you need a critical discussion. We cannot accept the rising housing costs. We cannot accept financialization. And we also cannot accept that people have no whatever perspective to get a better income or a stable job. Because precarity, both in income and in housing, has in fact always aggravated, when you look at the current corona crisis, the situation. Precarity is,
thank you, Michaela,
is hell.
Yes, yeah. This is very clear. Let me, I think we just have time for one more question from Zoom, from the floor. And this relates to something which was in your article, Michaela, and this is the financialization of housing. In your article, and you mentioned it here as well, the fact that Berlin's social housing stock was sold to some private entities. This is not surprising from me coming from the UK. We've been doing this professionally for many, many years. So I guess, you know, an open question to you, to Claudio, to all of our, you know, panelists is, to what extent do you think this crisis might encourage more public investment, accountable public investment in housing, to deal with some of these more predatory practices from the private sector that saw this as a great opportunity? And I'm just saying this because I'm piggybacking, because the public sector has been so proactive in terms of national spending in a lot of the countries, where our national debts are increasing exponentially, but that's not necessarily wrong if we're investing in the right thing. So to what extent do you think public investments can push out some of these more predatory private investments in the housing sector? Is this an opportunity?
I think it will depend on but all the others should also comment. I think it will depend very much on the economic development we see in Europe and on the way, for instance, tax revenues can be collected from states and cities to fill their budgets up, or you know, to finance affordable housing constructions. We have already seen in the aftermath of the global financial crisis a very preoccupying development. There was a shift between the housing investments on the one side, where it went into built investment, construction of social, municipal, whatever housing, and this went down because, and on the other side, the individual allowances went up, and this has really changed to the and this has really led to a crisis in housing financing, affordable housing investment. We lack 600 billion euros since 2008 in Europe, so that's not nothing.
Can I
Mari, yes.
comment from the perspective of Finland? Because I think our country is, even if we are decent in many of the spendings, now during the half year or so, I think we've made huge investment decisions for various things. So I would say see this moment for what Mikaela was asking for, comparative discussion, raising the issue on housing to the highest possible level. And then it might be that major changes could occur.
That's very interesting. As economists say, Mari, the invisible money tree was always there. It's just kind of come out now and we can all see it.
Exactly, and it's
Claudio.
funny to look at the outcomes.
Claudio.
Yeah, I think we need to properly respond to this question you made. We need to look in the different countries. And I think that in the developing world, by large, most of the rescue funding is about guaranteeing a minimum income for people to sail through the crisis and have food on the table, basically. And what Mikaela spoke about municipalities emerging and playing a much more prominent role in housing, and for her coming from Vienna is perhaps normal, but in other places of the world that's not so normal, but is a trend where places like in Brazil, where municipalities have a constitutionally protected autonomy and they have the control of major taxes, they actually putting up, let's say, their own strategies. But going back to I think at the moment, the trace of the funding is guaranteed. For example, the city of Niterói, who built up what they called, they give a name. Look, now I forgot the name, the word in English, but it's a fund that they developed for the future generations based on the royalties of oil in their territory. So they had this incredible fund which saved them during the crisis. What they did is first a package of income supply to households so that they could be landlocked in their house, so poor households that could stay because they got a card. With that card, they could purchase basic baskets in different places so they could survive the absence of job and the economy of agglomeration, as I spoke in the morning. And then the other was the small-scale enterprises, the support to the small-scale enterprises so that you keep the jobs. So I think that at the moment, in many places, what I observe is the focus is how do we get through this crisis and keeping people at least with the minimum income to survive. Now, I'm calling for the opportunity. It's a problem, but it's an opportunity. The current housing crisis can become an opportunity if we put different equations in place. And that's why I'm calling for a different approach where, the housing sector mobilizes a sizable amount of money. And unfortunately, the affordability leading to finance and economics have driven a lot of the program. So why? Because it generates jobs, it generates economic output, the industry drives, the private sector is happy, so they can start the machine of producing GDP through the construction sector. And then we see all these anomalies in Mexico and many places, including the Netherlands, where in a certain moment they went to the periphery to build social housing. But the opportunity that I say is that first reversing, and I think Nicola spoke about Mexico, and he probably knows that the big shift they did there was for example, to set up a certain boundary where beyond that boundary you had no support and no stimulus, no encouragement. But within that boundary, which means more compact, more densified, more organic growth within the city core, then you get government support to build. But a lot of resistance because people don't like, at least the data I saw, not enjoying very much that idea of living densities. But back to where I think the government will, I have no doubt about that, without a state commitment and robust finance, we won't get out of this crisis very easy. And I think the EU already, with the Green Deal, showed that this is how it goes.
Yes.
And I think this kind of a stimulus, and I'm hopeful, because you said that I was a bit enthusiastic or maybe
Optimistic.
optimistic, because I am, because I think it's a unique opportunity where we can regroup, rethink. We know we cannot continue doing the things we have been doing throughout this year, because we know the result. Open your window. This is what we have, is we continue doing this. So we need to shift. And one of the shifts, I think, is really intervening in the land sector. Doesn't matter where you are in Europe, in US especially, and Latin America, Asia, landowners, they bite on their land like bulldogs in their bone. They don't let it go, and they're not willing to open. So how do you solve? Are they the only one who have the benefit? So I think that's one of the issues, the political fight we will have, to have location, good location, so that people don't need to travel that much. And if you are poor, you can live also in the city center, or you can also live. So the diversity of supply and that government intervention. Without that, forget it. The market won't give you that.
Thank you, Claudio. I'm aware of time, and we've gone over our time, but there's some fascinating discussions here. For the audience members who weren't able to access the texts, the ideas of Michela, of Mari, Nicola, Alonso, and Claudio, they're all online. So please access the platform, and you will read the essays, and you'll become more familiar with some of the discussions that we'll be having today. On the chat, my apologies, I haven't been able to relay most of the questions, but there's some fascinating comments. There is a recommendation for you, Michela, from an audience that you can see on a place data model from the Lincoln Institute. So please do also look at the chat functionality. What we will do now is take a break, and we will thank our panelists for this session before beginning our next session with Bruce Katz. So Nicola, Alonso, Michela, Mari, and Claudio, thank you so much for your participation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good, everyone. So let's take a 5-minute rest break, so you can put your cameras on pause. So that's only for you, Bruce.
Okay.
The other panelists, if you want to stay for the inclusive growth session, you're more than welcome to stay. But that's up to you. And I'll unmute myself in 5 minutes' time.
There we go. Living on Zoom.
That's right. Hi, Bruce. So I'll very quickly introduce the session, and then we'll have the dialogue together.
Yeah, and you know, I have a hard stop at 10 because
I do know that. Yes, we'll have half an hour together. Yes.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy, crazy, crazy. How have you been?
Good, actually. Yes, a lot to catch up on, but it's time to start actually. So,
okay,
it's past, and welcome back, everyone. So, welcome to this session, second session on the masterclass on inclusive growth, and I guess there are some very important links to the previous conversation, and specifically Claudio's intervention towards the end. You know, one of the main priorities to make sure that, at least on the demand side of the housing spectrum, households have enough income to lead a quality that is worthwhile leading, in the words of Amartya Sen. And so the aspect of inclusive growth, for those of you who've accessed the online course, speaks of economic growth that benefits everyone and that doesn't let anyone behind. And that is the inclusivity agenda that the whole economics professions, both city economists, urban economists, and national economists have been preoccupied with over the last decade at least. How do we move to an economic growth model that has positive social returns to the majority of people? I'm very pleased to be joined by Bruce Katz for the next 30 minutes. Bruce will have to leave us in 30 minutes time precisely, so we'll make sure to get all of his input in the first 30 minutes. A lot of you know Bruce through his many publications. He's the co-founder of a very exciting organization called the New Localism Advisors. And of course, he was the former director of the Metropolitan Program at the Brookings Institute, and we've collaborated together over the years. And I guess, you know, Bruce, what I would like to do, in one sense, to open up the conversation here with us, is to start defining what we mean by inequalities, which are so intrinsically linked to inclusive growth. The fact that some people over the last 30 to 40 years have fared much better than others. And I'd just like to kind of start the conversation with two different definitions of inequalities that have different then repercussions for inclusive growth. The first are interpersonal inequalities, as is shown by this slide, which I hope that you can all see, which looks at a number of US cities. I think there are 20 on the screen, in 1970 and in 2015. Mm-hmm. And what each graph shows, so on the top is Atlanta, then it's Boston, Chicago, they go alphabetically. They basically subdivide the households into income brackets. The lower income households will be on the left in each diagram in white, and the higher income households towards the right in dark red. And one of the general observations that you see in the 1970 distribution is that they are pretty much bell jar distributions, or what we sometimes call middle class city distributions, that you have the majority of households within the middle three income brackets. And then you move to the same cities and exactly the same measurement, median household income in 2015, and see how certain cities have been greatly affected or greatly reshaped. Some of them, like San Diego, Pittsburgh, New Haven, have retained their middle class distribution, let's say. But others, whether it's Washington, DC, whether it's San Francisco, whether it's Atlanta, and whether it's New Orleans, have very different distributions. So that's the first very important characteristics. And I'm just using here US data on interpersonal inequalities, i.e. the difference between someone stuck in the first column in white versus other households stuck in dark red. And the second definition, which I think is extremely important, are not the interpersonal inequalities between people, but the territorial inequalities between places. And here I'm just looking at European data, this is from Regio GIS, of regions or cities specifically that have fared much better compared to a national average, and in lighter green, those regions that have fared actually poorly. And this is data, longitudinal data going over 30 years. And the argument here on territorial inequalities is why have certain cities or villages or towns fared much worse than other places. There's no better place to describe this than here, where I stand in the UK, where a lot of these places that we often call the places left behind have revolted in the polls over the last 5 years. And the whole national political landscape has completely been affected by these territorial inequalities. So these are the two types of inequalities that I would first like to discuss with you, Bruce, and specifically the responses. And what I would like to do is two things. First, spatially blind responses, typically taken at the federal level or national level, to deal both with interpersonal inequalities, but also territorial inequalities. What can the federal level or federal government do to make sure that certain parts in the US that have been left behind catch up with some of the successful cities that we have always been obsessed with, your New Yorks, your San Franciscos, the good stories. And of course, secondly, what at the national level can we do in order for the interpersonal inequalities that are happening in our cities? So that's the first part, and then we will move on to the more targeted spatial policies. What can we do at the city level to deal with these issues?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, and very provocative start. I think we've got to ask ourselves first the question of why are so many places and people being left behind? I mean, how much of this is a new kind of economic restructuring that's going on? It's market-driven, leading to the concentration of a few agglomeration economies in the United States, Europe, and beyond. And how much is due to other factors that may be more within our control. Over the last several years, I've increasingly been focused on the financialization of this spatial divide in the US. How much our institutional investors overinvest in the San Franciscos, in the New Yorks, in the Los Angeles, and underinvest in the rest of the country. 83% of venture capital in the United States basically goes to Northern California, Southern California, Boston, and New York. I don't think that's what the market wants. I think what we have is a myopia of institutional investors and their asset managers, pension funds, university endowments, private wealth. So that can be corrected. I'm not sure it necessarily requires national action. What the national governments should do is begin to invest at scale in innovation and in an infrastructure that would enable what are still very vital and vibrant places in the US, in the heartland, who have advanced research institutions, have very distinct economies, have global competitive advantages, to realize their full potential in the 21st century. So part of what I think has been happening is part of the financialization of our economy. And also where the federal government could act is frankly around antitrust policies. The national government has allowed the rise of the large, the Amazons, the Apples, the Microsofts, and on the retail sector, as we've seen with COVID, the Walmarts, the Targets, big box retail, e-commerce, basically squashing small business and authentic, organic, locally owned enterprises. So that may be the most important place for the national government, frankly, to intervene, not just around spatial divisions, but this division between a monopoly economy and an economy which is more atomistic and more distributed. That frankly relates to the racial and other disparities on income at the interpersonal level, because the economy has basically allowed and rewarded companies to move towards more and more low-wage, suppressed wages for a whole range of reasons. I mean, this is probably not worth a 30-minute call, but a 3-day conversation. But the national government's role, I think, is to, through healthcare, through various other income transfers, in general and in specific, housing could be one of the sectors they can engage on, through the tax system. We have an earned income tax credit in the United States, but basically begin to move what is now tens of millions of Americans to a point where they have a living wage, and correct for market distortions and market deficiencies. So the national government is critical. Frankly, as you know, I spend most of my time from the bottom up rather than the top down, thinking how sectors and stakeholders within cities and metropolitan areas organize themselves to drive inclusive growth, and this period prepare themselves for new forms of federal intervention.
Bruce, thank you very much for this. And I guess, you know, one of the dimensions that the online material covered was the two options, at least in the spatially blind policies to deal with inequalities, that I think are very relevant for the US. And it will be very interesting to hear your thoughts. First, the capacity to really rethink the taxation system, and to what extent, whether through the recent, Trump tax cuts, whether through the relatively low high-income bracket tax, is there any opportunity there, or is it a lost cause to even talk about this in the US? So that's one aspect, the kind of, the white elephant in the room, which is always, taxation. And the second, which relates to what you said around governments investing in innovation, was linked, and this is again, I'm referring to the online course, was linked very much to the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who says that is fine, but we need a better way of getting a fair share of the public-private benefit. So yes, we can invest in national innovation programs, we can put more money in new technological missions, but how can we actually then make sure that some of these new big corporates that you mentioned to them, innovative companies, contribute, in one sense, back from the initial public investments?
Well, so I do think that there is a political opening. It depends on how our election goes. If the Democrats win the White House, the Senate, and the House, they run the trifecta, so to speak. I think there will be a move towards a more progressive tax policy. We're not going to go back to where we were, 30 or 40 years ago, but there will be substantial shifts. This will also occur, frankly, at the state level as well, and perhaps in some cities and metropolitan areas. At the city and metropolitan area, it's obviously easier for wealthy households to move to avoid the tax.
Mm-hmm.
But so I do think I think there's an opening right now, but it depends on how the election plays out. Irrespective of whether there's a progressive tax policy put in place, it will be interpreted as the Republicans as a tax on the middle class, and sold as a tax on the middle class, even though it isn't. But that's how it'll be sold. So in terms of Mariana's thoughts, which I think are brilliant, I think she's right. I think with regard not just to innovation policy, but with development policy around land, value appreciation, and the distribution of value appreciation between the public and the private needs to be fundamentally rethought. Most of my work focuses on more how at the local level, you, through public, private, civic, university, community relationships, you get the innovation flywheel moving faster. The US in particular invests a substantial amount of money through our defense, military, through our National Institute of Health, to some extent through the energy sector, in basic science and basic research and development. Many cities do not commercialize that research at the level that they should or could. And so national policy tends to be an investor, but the real action is local. And there's a big difference between the MITs and the Stanfords of the world, or the Carnegie Mellons and the Georgia Techs of the world, and everyone else. Mm-hmm. So I think Mariana's right, but what I'm focusing on is, can we get a quality job burst in the US, in the St. Louis's of the world, the Cincinnati's of the world, based more on local cohesion and local networking. And then I think she's right that there needs to be a different equity split.
Thanks, Bruce. And I guess this brings us to the second part, which is very much tied to what you're saying. You know, to what extent can we target policies in the St. Louis's of this world, and there's many other UK precedents that I can think of, that will, in one sense, deal both with the interpersonal inequalities within the administrative boundaries of the cities, but also to what extent can they catch up with the rest of the country? Because this is, of course, a very big dilemma. It's not good seeing absolute levels of household income increase if in relative terms these places are still falling further behind from the more successful cities. So can you tell a bit more about some of the examples of these targeted policies at the local level that you think have worked in the US?
So the examples that we tend to use in the US are Pittsburgh or Indianapolis, where you have public, private, and civic leaders unlocking local wealth. So instead of moving a lot of market investment outside of their metropolitan areas, they're keeping it within. And they're investing patient capital in centers of excellence at their universities. They're investing in intermediaries that can match mature companies with startups, match labor supply with business demand, very intense focus on upgrading the skills of workers so they can participate more in these quality jobs, match the purchasing of goods and services that comes from universities, hospitals, and corporations, and keep it local, as opposed to group pooling purchases and just selling it or having someone in another part of the country provide the service because they're providing the lowest price. So I think we've tended in the past in many countries, frankly, to A, focus too much on the national government, and B, focus too much on the public sector, when actually economies and cities, metropolitan areas are networks. And where you have networks that come together and collaborate to compete and collaborate to invest and harness the full power of their areas, Pittsburgh and Indianapolis have done that at scale. It requires institutional responses. In Indianapolis, they have something called the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. And that's where the corporations, universities, and philanthropies sit. And they basically come together not to discuss strategies, but to basically collaborate on investments in companies, in sectors, in universities, in talent. I think there is a new localism in politics and a new localism in economies that needs to be more understood, because the federal government, at the end of the day, is a slow-moving, super tanker. And a lot of the times we focus on the flow, we focus on the new investments they make, as opposed to the stock, the trillions of dollars they already invest in our country. I'm more interested in how stakeholders locally bend national spending to fit their own priorities, leverage their own economies. And yes, there will be, if a Biden administration comes in, there'll be a whole bunch of new fancy programs and initiatives, that might try to basically lead to the rise of the rest. But I think there's already latent power and under-leveraged assets that need to be understood. And therefore, we can really have these cities and metropolitan areas realize their full potential, again, from the bottom up.
So let me just kind of follow up with a question from the Zoom channel, and I guess it's on this aspect of under-leveraged assets or opportunities for investors. So the question is, how would you recommend that we as investors make sure that we don't make territorial inequality stronger with how we invest? And I guess also this returns with your myopic view of investment when we started the conversation. So what would be your recommendations?
Well, I think, there is a herd instinct in the investor world. And it tends to sort of just, literally follow each other down the same rat hole. And so there's several ways of thinking about this. If you're looking at a particular kind of asset class in the hyper growth markets, why not look at that asset class in markets that actually do have a lot of strengths? So if you're looking at mixed use development, which is a big part of the asset class investment, don't just do it in San Francisco or Boston and New York, which are completely overheated, but think about investing near Carnegie Mellon or near Washington University or think about investing around innovation hubs of our heartland cities and our Midwestern cities, because they have enormous inherent strengths. And I think the value appreciation coming from those investments may actually be larger for market investors than just being the 195th investor in San Francisco in a particular asset class. The other piece is to think about innovation more broadly. I think there's an innovation blind spot in the United States. I think most of the venture capital looks for what we would call white tech. It's just this certain kind of startup or perhaps even scale up. And again, it's a herd instinct. We've done it before, we'll do it again. Well, you're leaving out large portions of the population that actually have very sound, even more innovative ideas, whether it's B2B or B2C. And I think that's going to require more diversity among fund managers, as well as new kind of products and new kinds of asset classes. So, this is why I think the focus on only public responses to spatial disparities is way too narrow. I think what we have is a financial sector that basically needs reform from within. I don't think you can regulate or legislate this. I think it has to be a series of first mover institutional investors and asset managers, which is what you see on the climate side. You see divest, invest taking hold. Well, we need the same kind of activity occurring across the economy.
Thanks, Bruce. And let me just for a minute before you leave us, play a bit the devil's advocate here. And in one sense, the places that do have the Carnegie Mellons are already in a better position.
Right.
And what I'm interested in is what you said before in terms of thinking about a new localism as a network of cities. And in the online course, we presented this as an industrial strategy that is regional, that doesn't put one city in competition with another, which is the classical model that we saw in the US and in many European cities, the race to the bottom, where you're competing for funds or inward investment. So to what extent do you see glimpses of US cities working together as networks to deal with some of these areas of specialization without necessarily getting into each other's foot? And I think that, pushes the agenda into the territorial inequality, because all of a sudden you have to think outside of your administrative boundaries.
Right. I think that's a great question. And my own view of the world is that there are more Pittsburghs than people think. Number one, it doesn't cover the whole landscape, but we really do have a network of cities. Unlike Europe, the US really, because of our size, in many respects, created many globally significant metropolitan areas, not cities, but metropolitan areas that have very distinctive economies and very distinctive advantages. And we need to leverage those, starting from the local. I think what's going to happen going forward, and the Nordics tend to lead us in this direction, is to think about competitive policy as well as climate investment in many other areas of domestic policy as a collective act. And the way in which most national policy works today and how most city consortia are organized is, at the end of the day, every tub is on its own bottom. You know, every city is responsible for design, finance, and delivery of initiatives. I think what the Nordics have done in Denmark with KL, in Sweden with Kommuninvest, is to think about aggregating the market power of cities and the political power of cities so that ultimately they can negotiate with national governments and global financial institutions, and they can create products, financial products and investment models in their own image. And then what you have is a portfolio. You know, in the Kommuninvest model in Sweden, every city comes forward with their climate project. They're pooled, so you de-risk for the investors, and you enable them to have access to low-cost quality capital. You know, the US, most of our multi-city consortia are just advocacy organizations. They're just lobbying organizations. What I think is we want cities to aggregate their market power and act their market power. And that will help some of the weaker cities begin to get the kind of access to quality capital that they need.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'm just waiting to see, let me see if there are any further questions from the floor. And in one sense, you know, Bruce, what you're saying is fascinating, and I would highly recommend for those participants on the Zoom channel to look at Bruce's book, The New Localism, which has some fascinating insights and also great stories coming from the US on some of these issues. Bruce, can I thank you very much for joining us in this channel, and good luck with the rest of the day.
Well, I wish I had more time. This is actually the fun part of my day. Now it's just work.
There you go. Thanks
Great
again.
to see everyone.
Thank you
care.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good, everyone. So what I would like to do is to continue on some of the topics that were presented in the online course. And for those of you who went through the material or who have access to the material and have any questions, please do put this on the Q&A channel, and I'll be more than happy to answer. This is at least my area of specialization at the LSE. And what I would like to do is just first, you know, say a small story, which is a personal story of me as a young economist coming to the LSE 20 years ago, fascinated by works that you're all very familiar with, such as Saskia Sassen's work on the global city. And there, you know, economic geographers were fascinated by what makes certain cities successful. And we all accepted that that success, measured in very narrow terms, in economic terms, would lead to negative externalities, right? So there will be overcrowding, house prices will increase, if we're kind of trying to relate this to our previous session. But that if we focused with some of these negative externalities, all would be good. At least that was the kind of, you know, previous model, that it was all around a redistribution mechanism. We're going to correct the negative externalities of this economic growth model after the damage has happened. And of course, for a lot of us, what, you know, came not as a surprise, but it finally came in the political limelight, in the spotlight, was the events in the US and in the UK of the types of places that we knew existed in the UK and the US, finally saying in the polls and in the ballot that we're upset with our places being left behind. And there is great research by Andres Rodriguez-Pos that at least at the UK and European level, there's been some regression analysis showing that economic change over time was one of the key determinants of the Brexit vote. It wasn't about interpersonal inequalities. The poorest of the poor did not vote for Brexit. One of the leading factors when you regress the analysis was actually the places that were left behind over a period of 30 years. And so all of a sudden, we as enthusiastic economists that were fascinated by the big cities, this is why I came to London in the first place, saying, okay, we got it all wrong. That it's not only about the interpersonal inequalities, but also the wider territorial inequalities. And of course, as an urbanist, this is difficult because initially I was trained to think about the success of my city, thinking about the administrative boundaries and making sure that, in a multidimensional way, so not only in the narrow sense of economic growth, we all know this doesn't work and it doesn't add up. We needed to make sure that things were okay, but there was never in our textbook, let's say, of economic geographers to think about in regional terms what was happening. So let me just kind of finish off on saying that it's not that we did not invest in those places left behind. Of course we did. There were major investments, and in the UK, during the Tony Blair years, one of the key characteristics that the poorest places in terms of their GDP output had loads of investment, whether it was public investment in infrastructure, whether it was housing-led regeneration. We built plenty of those. We did invest. But what we're coming now to terms is, was it the right type of investment in terms of leading to wider household income growth? And I think this is where a lot of the debate is happening today. Now, I hope that you will get some time to look at the online course, the way that it was subdivided. And we only discussed the first part with Bruce on these spatially blind policies, i.e. irrespective of where you are, national industrial strategies or tax and spend programs for investment in healthcare and education are going to minimize some of the inequalities in our society. So that's fine. And then the course looked at two other types of strategies: spatially connective, where you invest in infrastructure, specifically transport infrastructure, where you're connecting specific left behind areas to areas of employment. And finally, spatially targeted policies, where you're looking at putting money in the poorest neighborhoods or the poorest part of your country. And within the course, you will see that there are many different guidelines of what worked or what didn't work in both these areas that would be of relevance. Now, I don't want to repeat some of this material. As I said, the IFHP Academy will be open for all of you to access as members, and there will be more online courses coming up. So what I would like to do now is to wrap up this masterclass, unless I can see more questions coming up. We still have a bit of time, but what I would like to do is to wrap up these two sessions. I guess one of the big factors here that is interrelated between the housing masterclass and the household and the inclusive growth is to what extent they're intricately bound, and specifically on the aspect when you have unaffordability driving down household incomes, which in respect of that drives further, lowers demand in the economy. If you spend more on housing, you spend more on the real businesses that are in your neighborhood, for example. So they're inextricably linked together. And I think this should be seen very much in part and parcel in the way that Claudio was mentioning this morning. Really seeing these things both on the demand and supply side of the housing question. On that point, I would like to thank you for being with us this afternoon. So for the last 2 hours, hearing our panelists. And again, please feel free to access the online content. It's there for you. And I do hope that you enjoy it. In that respect, I would just like now to close the session And thank you once again for your participation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. You did a good job.
Oh, Claudio, you were with us.
Yeah, it was.
Good, Claudio. See you very soon. Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone. Bye for
Take
now.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.